The year was 1945, and the Pacific skies carried the smell of ash and salt. Across islands once filled with soldiers and banners of the rising sun, there was now only silence. Japan's empire, once believed to be unshakable, was falling apart piece by piece. The cities that had stood for centuries were now oceans of rubble, their people surviving on a handful of rice, their hope buried beneath the ruins of ambition. It was a time when no one truly knew what tomorrow would look like. For the Japanese people, the war had become a storm that refused to end. For the soldiers, it was about honor. For civilians, it was about survival. But for women like Sakura Takahashi, it was something deeper, a test of what it meant to remain human when the world no longer remembered humanity. Sakura was born in Nagasaki, a quiet port city that smelled of sea breeze and coal smoke. Before the war, her life was ordinary. Her father was a teacher, her mother a homemaker, and her childhood was filled with laughter, school books and festivals. When she was 16, the government's propaganda machine was already in full swing. Teachers spoke of loyalty to the emperor, radio broadcasts praised Japan's conquests in China, and newspapers printed heroic tales of soldiers dying with smiles for the empire. The world outside Japan might have been uneasy, but within its borders the message was clear. Japan was destined to rule Asia, and those who doubted it were traitors. Sakura joined nursing school just as the winds of war grew stronger. She didn't do it for politics, she simply wanted to heal people. But by 1941, when Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, her life was swept into something she could no longer control. The country roared with pride after the news. Crowds filled the streets waving flags and shouting, "Banzai." Even Sakura's father, a quiet man of reason, looked at the newspaper with trembling hands. "We have woken the giant," he whispered, though no one around him seemed to understand what he meant. The Japanese empire expanded faster than anyone had imagined. The fall of Singapore, the capture of the Philippines, the victory in Malaya. It was as if Japan could not lose. The newspapers called it divine destiny. The people called it justice for centuries of Western domination. Yet, behind the triumphant headlines, the cost was already immense. Young men were sent to die by the thousands. The empire stretched too far, too fast, and whispers began to circulate about the cruelty of the occupation forces and the suffering in conquered lands. By 1943, Sakura was assigned to a military field hospital in the Philippines. It was a far cry from the clean wards she had trained in. The building was little more than bamboo walls and a dirt floor. Supplies were scarce, and the air smelled of disinfectant and death. The wounded poured in daily, soldiers missing limbs, coughing blood, crying for mothers who would never hear them again. She worked day and night, stitching wounds with trembling hands, her white uniform stained with the dark red of war. The soldiers treated her with respect, but kept their distance. To them, she was a symbol of purity in a place consumed by chaos. Some confessed their fears in quiet moments, saying they would rather die in battle than be captured. They spoke of American soldiers as demons, men who tortured and humiliated prisoners. That fear ran deep, fed by propaganda and by the Japanese belief that surrender was the greatest change. Sakura tried not to think about it, but every night as bombs echoed in the distance she felt her stomach twist. By 1944, the war had turned. The Americans, once thought to be on the defensive, began to strike back with a fury that shook the empire. The skies above the islands thundered with aircraft. The Japanese Navy was losing ship after ship. Sakura and the other nurses could see the desperation in the eyes of the officers who visited their hospital. Food rations grew smaller, medicine ran out, and orders came from Tokyo that no one was to be taken prisoner. Death was preferable. When American troops landed nearby, panic spread through the camp. Soldiers dug trenches, burned documents, and prepared for a last stand. Sakura was ordered to help destroy medical supplies so they wouldn't fall into enemy hands. She hesitated. Those bandages and bottles of morphine could save lives, but the officer's voice was firm. "We must not let the enemy use what belongs to the emperor." As the flames devoured the supplies, she felt something break inside her. The Americans advanced quickly, their tanks rumbling through villages, their aircraft cutting through the sky like hawks. The Japanese forces retreated deeper into the jungle. Sakura and the other nurses followed, carrying what little they could. The heat was unbearable, the mosquitoes relentless, and the fear constant. They hid in caves, surviving on rainwater and whatever food the soldiers could scavenge. Then one night the gunfire stopped. The jungle went quiet except for the distant hum of engines. The next morning, they were surrounded. American soldiers appeared from between the trees, their rifles raised, their uniforms covered in dust. Sakura froze. Her mind screamed for her to bite her tongue, to die before dishonor, as she had been taught, but she couldn't move. Her legs shook, her hands trembled, and before she could act, a voice shouted something in English. A few of the soldiers lowered their weapons. One of them, tall and sunburned, gestured for her to come forward. The nurses huddled together, whispering prayers. One woman tried to grab a knife, but Sakura stopped her. The Americans didn't fire. Instead, they motioned for the women to follow. Confused and terrified, they obeyed. The soldiers gave them water. Cold, clean water. It was the first time Sakura had tasted something that wasn't tainted or muddy in weeks. They were escorted to a truck. The soldiers didn't touch them or shout at them. They just looked tired. Some even smiled awkwardly as if trying to reassure them. It made no sense. These were supposed to be the monsters, the enemy, yet here they were, helping the very women who had sworn allegiance to the emperor who sent their comrades to die. The truck ride was long. Dust filled the air, the road bumpy and uneven. Sakura stared at the horizon, watching the sun sink behind the mountains. She thought of her family in Nagasaki, of the house with the paper walls and the plum tree outside her window. She wondered if she would ever see it again. When they arrived at the camp, she expected the worst: barbed wire, dogs, shouting guards. Instead, she saw tents, wooden huts, and a flag fluttering in the wind. The Americans led them to a building where a doctor and a nurse were waiting. The doctor spoke gently, his tone calm, though she couldn't understand the words. He examined their wounds, cleaned their cuts, and gave them food. Sakura stared as he worked, unable to comprehend how an enemy could treat her like a patient. That night she lay on a cot staring at the canvas ceiling of the tent. Around her, the other women slept uneasily, whispering in their dreams. Outside she could hear laughter, the voices of American soldiers talking, their accents strange and rhythmic. She felt an ache in her chest that she couldn't name. Days passed, and slowly the fear began to fade. The soldiers brought food, canned meat, bread, fruit she hadn't tasted in years. They gave the women clean clothes. Some even offered books or newspapers, though none of them could read the foreign words. The Americans were cautious but kind. There were rules, of course. They couldn't wander freely, but compared to what they had expected, it was unthinkable mercy. Sakura noticed that the American camp wasn't what she had imagined. There were guards, yes, but they weren't cruel. They joked among themselves, shared cigarettes, played music on small radios. Some were barely older than the Japanese soldiers she had treated. In their eyes, she didn't see hatred, only exhaustion. One afternoon, as she was helping another nurse hang laundry, she saw two American nurses walking toward them. They carried boxes filled with supplies. Sakura's instinct was to step back, but one of them, a blonde woman with a kind face, smiled and said, "Konnichiwa." Her accent was strange, but familiar enough to make Sakura blink in surprise. The nurse handed her a small bar of soap. "For you," she said, then pointed to herself. "Helen." Sakura bowed awkwardly. She didn't know what to say. She had spent years thinking of Americans as faceless enemies. Yet here was one smiling at her, offering something as simple as soap. That night, as she washed her hands, she caught the faint scent of lavender. It was the first pleasant smell she had encountered in months. In the days that followed, Sakura began to observe more closely. The Americans treated the male prisoners fairly, even the ones who still glared at them with defiance. They respected their traditions, sometimes letting them pray or write letters. It confused her. War was supposed to destroy everything human, and yet in this strange place, something like kindness still existed. When she thought back to the burned hospitals, the dead soldiers, the screams in the jungle, she wondered if the world outside the camp had gone mad while this small corner had somehow remained sane. She didn't know what would happen next, whether she would live, whether she would ever go home, but she knew one thing for certain. Everything she had believed about the enemy was beginning to fall apart. The war raged on, and the Pacific Theater became a stage of unimaginable brutality and resilience. The Japanese Empire, once confident and indomitable, found itself slowly tightening under the pressure of the Allied advance. The Philippines had fallen, Iwo Jima was in ruins, and Okinawa burned under relentless bombardment. Amid these crumbling defenses, a different kind of battle was being waged. One not of bullets or bombs, but of survival, identity, and humanity. In the dense jungles of the Philippines, far from the cries of Tokyo and the roars of American B-29 bombers, a group of Japanese women, nurses, clerks, and wives of officers, struggled to stay alive. When American forces landed and began liberating the islands, many of these women were captured, trembling and terrified, expecting the worst. They had been told stories since childhood that the Americans were monsters, brutes who killed without mercy, who humiliated women, who treated captives like animals. They believed they would rather die with honor than be taken alive. But when they were captured, death didn't come. Instead, something stranger did. The women were led into American-run POW camps, organized, clean, and surprisingly humane. The soldiers who guarded them were young, weary, and polite. They didn't yell or strike. They offered food, medicine, and clean water. The Japanese women, hollow-eyed from months of starvation and fear, could barely comprehend what they were seeing. One of them, a young nurse named Aiko, recalled how the first night in the camp felt like a dream. She was given a blanket, rice, and even a small cup of coffee, a taste she'd never known. It was bitter, but she sipped it slowly, letting the warmth fill her body. Across the barracks, another woman wept quietly, whispering that she had not slept on a bed in 2 years. For the first time, they weren't afraid of being bombed or assaulted. They were simply alive. Days passed, and the women began to observe the Americans with cautious curiosity. They laughed easily, shared cigarettes, and often treated their captives with a strange kind of respect. There was discipline, yes, but also a sense of compassion that none of the women had been prepared for. Aiko remembered how one of the American medics, a tall man from Texas named Miller, had bandaged her arm after she injured it, carrying water. He had smiled kindly, asking, "You okay, ma'am?" The word ma'am struck her so gentle, so foreign, so undeserved. Still, many of the women remained suspicious. They whispered among themselves that this kindness was a trick, that perhaps the Americans were softening them for interrogation or humiliation. Their fears were not unfounded. War had stripped them of trust. Every smile seemed dangerous, every act of generosity suspicious. But time began to wear down their defenses. The war was ending, and in this strange captivity they were witnessing a world unlike the one they had been taught to hate. One morning, something extraordinary happened. A convoy arrived carrying supplies, food, blankets, medical kits, and to everyone's surprise, small parcels wrapped in brown paper. The women were gathered near the courtyard when one of the American officers began distributing the items. When Aiko's turn came, she opened the package and froze. Inside was a small glass bottle of perfume and a bright red lipstick. At first, she didn't understand. Perfume? Lipstick? She turned to her companions in disbelief. "What is this for?" she asked softly. The officer smiled and shrugged. "For you," he said simply. "You're free women now. Every lady deserves to feel like one." The camp erupted in murmurs. Some women laughed nervously. Others wept. Many had forgotten what it felt like to even be seen as women. For years they had been soldiers, servants, survivors, never feminine, never adorned. The lipstick was more than makeup. It was a symbol, a gesture that said, "You are human again." Aiko held the small tube in her hand, trembling. The color was bright, so unlike anything in Japan. She uncapped it slowly and caught the faint scent of vanilla and wax. A mirror was passed around, and for the first time in years, the women saw their own faces, thin, pale, eyes shadowed by exhaustion, yet still alive. When Aiko finally applied the lipstick, she couldn't recognize the woman in the reflection. Her lips glowed red against her tired skin. She smiled, a small, uncertain smile, and then laughed for the first time since the war began. Nearby, another woman, Yumi, opened her perfume bottle and dabbed a drop on her wrist. The scent of flowers filled the air, a fragrance so sweet and delicate it brought tears to her eyes. She whispered, "It smells like peace." And perhaps it did. The American soldiers, watching from a distance, didn't fully grasp the weight of what they had done. To them, these were small comforts, a way to show mercy, to bring humanity back into a place ravaged by hatred. But to the Japanese women, these simple gifts carried a meaning beyond words. They were reminders that even after the world had burned, something beautiful still existed. As weeks went by, the women began to talk more freely with their guards. They shared stories, hesitantly at first, about their homes, their families, their fears. Some of the Americans told them about their own lives back in the States, farms in Kansas, sisters in New York, sweethearts waiting by the porch light. The realization slowly dawned that these enemies were not monsters but men, young, weary men who missed their mothers, who wanted to go home just as desperately as they did. In the quiet of the camp, unlikely friendships began to bloom. One soldier, Private Harris, had a habit of playing his harmonica at night. The tune was soft, almost mournful, and the women would listen from their bunks, their minds wandering to memories of home. Aiko once approached him, curious, and asked about the song. He smiled and said it was called Blue Moon. He handed her the harmonica for a moment, and when she tried to play it, the note came out crooked and high, and they both laughed. That laughter, echoing through the camp, felt like sunlight breaking through a storm. But outside the fences, the war was far from over. In Japan, cities were burning, Tokyo reduced to ashes, Hiroshima and Nagasaki soon to follow. The women didn't yet know of the atomic bomb, or the surrender that would soon come. They only felt the strange in-between. No longer enemies, but not yet free. The world was shifting, and they were caught between the wreckage of the old and the fragile hope of the new. Then, one hot August afternoon, the camp buzzed with strange energy. Officers gathered, messages were exchanged, and then it was announced. Japan had surrendered. The war was over. There was silence, then murmuring, and then unexpectedly crying. Some women wept with relief, others in disbelief. They thought of home, of parents who might still be alive, of brothers who never returned. The Americans were solemn. They too had lost friends, family, and years they would never get back. A few days later, the Japanese women were told they would be repatriated. Ships would take them home. The news brought mixed emotions, joy and sorrow, hope and fear. America had become, in a strange way, a place of rebirth for them. The kindness of strangers, the perfume, the lipstick, these had reshaped their understanding of humanity. Yet they knew they must return, to rebuild, to face the ruins of what remained. Before they left, Aiko approached Miller and handed him a folded handkerchief embroidered with cherry blossoms. "For you," she said softly. "Thank you for reminding me what it means to be human." He smiled, taking it carefully, and replied, "Don't forget to keep smiling, ma'am." The women boarded the ships in silence, clutching their small belongings, blankets, ration tins, and, in many cases, that same tube of lipstick. As the ship pulled away from the harbor, Aiko stood on the deck, watching America fade into the horizon. She touched her lips, now bare, and whispered a quiet promise to herself, never to forget the moment when the war ended inside her heart, not with surrender, but with compassion. The sea wind carried the faint scent of flowers, mixed with salt and smoke, and though she did not yet know what awaited her in Japan, she felt something she hadn't felt in years, a fragile, impossible hope. When the ship finally reached the Japanese coast, the sight that awaited Aiko and the other women was both heartbreaking and surreal. Cities that once stood proud and bustling were now reduced to charred skeletons of wood and ash. The skyline was nothing but smoke and silence. Tokyo looked like a sea of broken glass and twisted metal. Hiroshima and Nagasaki, names that now carried unimaginable sorrow, were nothing but haunting memories of life that had vanished in a blinding flash. The air was heavy with loss. People wandered through ruins, their faces blank, their movements slow, as if they were ghosts of a vanished empire. The returning women stepped off the ship, unsure of what awaited them. They were no longer prisoners, but they were also not the same women who had been captured months ago. The war had taken their families, their faith, their sense of nationhood. Yet something deep within them, something faint but alive, had been rekindled in the American camps. It was the memory of kindness, the faint scent of perfume, the color of lipstick that symbolized hope amidst ruin. Aiko carried the lipstick carefully in her pocket. She didn't wear it often. She only opened the case to remind herself that beauty still existed in the world. Each time she saw its red gleam, she remembered the American soldier's soft smile and the way he said, "Every lady deserves to feel like one." It echoed in her heart as she walked through the ruins of her home. Her parents were gone. The family home in Yokohama had been flattened in a bombing raid. The neighbors she remembered from childhood were missing or displaced. She found a temporary shelter near a temple where survivors gathered to share food and memories. There were no soldiers, no uniforms, just people trying to start over with the ashes they had left. One afternoon, while helping to cook rice for the hungry, Aiko met a woman named Hanako. She was another former POW, though from a different camp. They shared similar experiences: fear of capture, shock at kindness, disbelief at the small gifts the Americans gave. Hanako too had received perfume, and she carried the empty bottle with her even after it ran dry. "When I smell it," Hanako said softly, "I remember that there was still good in the world." Together, they began volunteering at a small aid station run by American forces during the occupation. It was strange at first, serving tea and medicine to the same kind of men they had once been taught to hate. But Aiko noticed something. The Americans were no longer enemies. They spoke gently to the people, offered food to children, helped rebuild roads and schools. For many Japanese, this kindness was confusing. They had been told to fear the Americans, to see them as devils, but these soldiers brought chocolate, not chains. They brought laughter, not punishment. General Douglas MacArthur's policies encouraged compassion towards civilians, and this reflected deeply in the way ordinary Americans treated the people. Aiko often watched soldiers giving candy bars to children and helping the elderly cross streets. She began to understand something profound, that humanity could survive even after nations tried to destroy it. As the months passed, Japan began to change. The old empire was gone. Democracy and freedom were slowly taking its place. The occupation brought not only rebuilding but also the idea of equality, especially for women. American women who worked in the occupation offices wore skirts, lipstick, and confidence. They spoke openly, walked freely, and worked beside men as equals. For Aiko and the women around her, this was a revelation. One morning, Aiko was assigned to work as an interpreter at a Red Cross station. Her English was limited, but she was determined to improve. Her first task was translating between American nurses and Japanese mothers, seeking help for their children. She listened carefully to the words, repeating them slowly, feeling the meaning settle into her mind. "Medicine for fever," she said, pointing to a small bottle. The nurse smiled, and for the first time Aiko felt useful again, not as a victim, but as a bridge between two worlds. That evening she stood by the river, watching the sunset spread over the quiet city. Children played in the mud with makeshift toys, their laughter echoing softly. The smell of smoke still lingered, but there was something else in the air. Hope. The scent of peace was fragile but real. She reached into her pocket, took out the lipstick, and gently applied it. The red color caught the last rays of the sun, and for a moment she didn't see a broken city. She saw a beginning. The months turned into years, and Japan slowly rose from its ashes. Streets were rebuilt, shops reopened, and the hum of life returned. The American presence brought both tension and transformation. But for many women it was the first time they experienced empowerment. Education was encouraged, jobs became available, and the voice of women began to grow stronger. Aiko found herself working as a translator, full-time for a local newspaper that published bilingual stories articles about post-war recovery, cultural exchanges, and reconciliation. One day her editor assigned her to cover a story about a group of American veterans visiting Japan to pay respects to the fallen. She hesitated when she heard the name of one of the visiting soldiers, Lieutenant Miller. Her heart raced. Could it be the same man? When she arrived at the small memorial event, she saw him immediately. Older, with lines on his face, his uniform replaced by a simple suit. But the eyes were the same kind, calm, familiar. She approached quietly, and when he turned, recognition flickered. "Aiko," he asked softly, as though speaking to a memory. She smiled, her heart trembling. "You remembered." They spoke for hours, sharing stories of the war and the strange twists of fate that had brought them back together. Miller told her about his life in America, how he'd returned to his family's farm, married, lost friends to the war, and spent years trying to forget the blood and pain. But he said he never forgot the women in the camp, or the moment he handed that small gift, a lipstick, to Aiko. "You looked like you hadn't smiled in years," he said, "and when you did, I knew the war hadn't won." Aiko told him about her life after returning to Japan. The devastation, the slow rebuilding, the way that single act of kindness had shaped everything that followed. "That lipstick," she said, holding it in her hand, "became my reminder that humanity can't be destroyed by war. It can only be forgotten." Miller's eyes softened. "And now?" he asked. She looked at the city skyline, filled with lights and laughter again. "Now I remember," she said. Every day, the two walked along the rebuilt streets of Tokyo, surrounded by the sound of children playing and the hum of street vendors. There was no anger, no division, only the quiet understanding that they had both survived something greater than death itself. In the years that followed, Aiko continued her work as a journalist, often writing stories about forgiveness and renewal. She interviewed former soldiers from both sides, families of the fallen, and young women who were growing up in a Japan reborn. She wanted them to understand what she had learned, that the war had ended not just when the bombs stopped falling, but when compassion returned to human hearts. There were still scars, of course. Some people refused to forgive, others clung to bitterness. But for Aiko, every act of kindness, a smile, a shared meal, a small gift became a defiance against the cruelty of the past. She began giving talks to young students, telling them her story. When she spoke about the lipstick and perfume, they listened with wide eyes as if hearing a fairy tale. She would tell them, it wasn't the gift itself that mattered, it was what it meant. It meant that even in the darkest time, people can choose to be kind. One evening while walking home from the office, she saw a young girl standing by a market stall, staring longingly at a small mirror for sale. Her clothes were worn, her face smudged with dust. Without thinking, Aiko reached into her bag, took out the red lipstick she still carried, and handed it to the girl. For you, she said softly. Every girl deserves to feel like one. The child's eyes widened as she accepted it, her reflection shimmering faintly in the mirror's cracked glass. In that moment, Aiko felt the circle complete, the same gift passed on not as vanity but as a symbol of dignity and life. The past had come full circle, and in that act of giving she felt her own healing deepen. That night she returned home and opened her window. The breeze carried the sound of laughter from the streets below, mingling with the faint scent of flowers. She looked out at the city that had once been rubble and now glowed with life. Somewhere far across the ocean, she knew, there were people who remembered her too. People who had once been enemies but had become, through compassion, part of the same story of redemption. The war had taken many things. Homes, families, years of peace. But it had also revealed something indestructible, the resilience of the human heart. And in that truth, Aiko found her reason to live, to write, and to remember. Years continued to pass, and Japan changed beyond recognition. The once ruined streets of Tokyo now shimmered with neon lights in the hum of a new age. Modernity swept across the country like a cleansing wind. Skyscrapers rose where ashes once lay. Trains sped across bridges rebuilt with American steel, and the echo of war slowly faded beneath the rhythm of progress. But for Aiko, the past was never completely gone. It lived in quiet moments, in the flicker of a candle at the temple, in the scent of a flower that reminded her of the perfume she once received, in the faint rustle of the old handkerchief she still kept in a small box by her bedside. The years of peace brought prosperity but also questions. Japan had been defeated, yet its people were resilient, determined to transform shame into strength. American influence had reshaped the nation's schools, politics and culture. Jazz played in cafes, English words found their way into daily speech, and women began to move through the world with newfound confidence. But beneath the glitter of progress, Aiko saw something fragile, the need to remember what had been sacrificed to reach this peace. She often visited the war memorial in Chidorigafuchi, where countless unnamed soldiers rested. The marble gleamed under the sun, but it was the silence that always moved her most. Sometimes she would see elderly veterans standing alone, eyes fixed on the horizon, and she wondered if they too remembered moments of unexpected kindness amid the chaos. She imagined Miller somewhere in America, maybe walking through a quiet field, thinking about the same war that had both destroyed and connected them. One spring, as cherry blossoms painted Tokyo in delicate pink, Aiko received an invitation from the United States Embassy. It was for a memorial exhibition titled, "The War and Humanity, Remembering Through Compassion." The event would feature letters, artifacts, and stories from both American and Japanese survivors, testimonies of healing and reconciliation. When she read the letter, she felt her breath catch. They wanted her to contribute her story, the story of the perfume and the lipstick. At first she hesitated. It seemed too simple, too fragile to stand beside tales of battles and treaties. But as she looked out her window that evening and watched children playing under the falling petals, she realized that small stories were often the ones that carried the greatest truth. The war had been a vast storm of destruction, but it was the tiny acts of mercy that reminded humanity of itself. So she agreed. The exhibition opened that summer in Yokohama in a museum built near the harbor where the first American ships had once docked after the war. The halls were filled with photographs, smiling soldiers, civilians rebuilding their homes, women working in factories, children holding candy bars given by U.S. troops. There were letters from both sides, a Marine writing to his wife about meeting Japanese farmers who shared their rice with him, a Japanese teacher describing the kindness of American nurses after the bombings. In one glass case sat a small red lipstick tube and an empty perfume bottle, Aiko's artifacts. The label beneath them read, "Symbols of Humanity in War." People gathered around the display, whispering softly, moved by the simplicity of what they represented. Aiko stood nearby, quietly watching as strangers from different nations shared the same emotion, tears born not from pain but from understanding. Later that evening during the reception, she was approached by a young American woman. "Are you Miss Aiko Tanaka?" she asked politely. When Aiko nodded, the woman smiled. My grandfather was Lieutenant Miller. He passed away last year, but before he died he told me about a Japanese nurse who reminded him that kindness could survive even in war. I think you changed him. Aiko's eyes shimmered with emotion. She felt a deep warmth spread through her chest, a peace she hadn't known she was still seeking. He changed me too, she whispered. The young woman handed her a small envelope. Inside was a faded photograph. A group of American soldiers standing in front of the POW camp smiling. On the back, written in Miller's handwriting, were the words, "To Aiko, thank you for your courage to smile again." Aiko held the photograph close to her heart. The years fell away for a moment, and she was back in that dusty camp, under the scorching sun, holding a tiny tube of red lipstick and realizing that compassion could heal wounds that medicine never could. From that day she began speaking publicly about her experiences. Schools, community centers, and even television programs invited her to share her story. She didn't speak as a victim, nor as a patriot, but as a witness of humanity. Her talks were never grand or political. She would stand before a quiet audience, her voice gentle but steady, and begin, "In war we all lose something. But sometimes, even in the worst moments, a small act, a smile, a gift, a word can keep the world from losing its soul." Her story spread across Japan, then beyond. Newspapers in America wrote about her, and students from both countries began writing letters to her, thanking her for reminding them that peace was not just the absence of war, but the presence of empathy. She responded to many of them personally, her handwriting careful, her words simple. The world becomes kinder when we remember. Years later, when Aiko was well into her 70s, she received an invitation to visit the United States. The journey felt like stepping into another lifetime. The flight crossed the Pacific, the same ocean that had once separated enemies, and she watched the clouds drift beneath her like soft mountains. When the plane landed, and she stepped out into the sunlight of California, she felt as though she had come full circle. The Miller family welcomed her with open arms. They lived on a small farm surrounded by open fields and rows of apple trees. It was quiet, peaceful, and filled with the scent of earth and life. Miller's daughter, now an elderly woman herself, showed Aiko his old letters and photographs. In one frame was a picture of Miller holding a small cherry blossom handkerchief, the one she had given him decades earlier. They sat together on the porch as the sun dipped low, and Aiko felt a deep sense of connection that transcended language, culture, and time. "He always said you reminded him that even enemies could teach each other grace," the daughter said softly. Aiko looked out at the fields, her heart heavy yet light. "He reminded me," she replied, "that kindness can end a war long before peace is declared." Over the following days she visited museums, memorials, and schools, sharing her story with young Americans who had only read about the war in textbooks. They listened with wide eyes, surprised by the gentleness of her words. Many expected anger or sorrow, but instead she spoke of gratitude, of how war had shown her both the worst and best of humanity. At one school, a student asked, "Do you forgive what happened?" Aiko paused before answering. "Forgiveness," she said slowly, "is not forgetting. It is remembering differently. I remember not the bombs or fear, but the day a soldier handed me lipstick instead of a weapon." Her visit to America lasted 2 weeks, but the impact lingered far longer. When she returned to Japan, she was greeted by a group of young women at the airport holding small red ribbons as a tribute to her story. They called themselves the Lipstick Project. Their mission was to spread stories of kindness and resilience in times of crisis. Seeing them, Aiko felt her heart swell with pride. What began as a small act of humanity in a prisoner camp had become a message carried by generations. In her final years, Aiko continued to write quietly at her small desk by the window. Her journal was filled with reflections, memories of her parents, the war, the camp, the people she had met. One entry read, "The perfume is long gone, but the scent never leaves. The lipstick has faded, but the color remains in memory. It was not beauty they gave me that day, but the permission to be human again." She often dreamed of the past, not with fear but with understanding. Sometimes she saw the faces of those who hadn't survived. Sometimes she heard the faint melody of the harmonica that played in the camp at night, and in those dreams, the war no longer looked like death. It looked like a lesson written in the language of mercy. When she grew too old to travel, she would sit on her porch in Tokyo, watching children ride bicycles down the street, their laughter filling the air. The world had moved forward, yet it carried the invisible weight of history, the quiet reminder that peace must be tended like a fragile flower. And every spring, when cherry blossoms bloomed, she placed a single branch beside her window and whispered a prayer for both the living and the dead. The story of Aiko and the American soldier became a tale passed down through generations. It appeared in school books, documentaries, and memorial exhibitions. But for her, it was never about fame or remembrance. It was about a truth that needed to be lived, that compassion is stronger than hatred, and that the smallest kindness can change the course of a life, perhaps even the course of history. One night, as the city slept and the wind carried the scent of blooming sakura through her open window, Aiko reached into the old wooden box beside her bed. Inside, wrapped carefully in a cloth, was the red lipstick faded, worn, its gold casing tarnished by time. She held it in her hand, feeling the weight of years and memories, and smiled softly. The color had dulled, but the meaning had never faded. Outside, the first light of dawn touched the rooftops of Tokyo. The war was a lifetime away, yet its lesson remained alive in her heart, a reminder that humanity survives not because of power or victory, but because even in the darkest places, someone chose to be kind.